I'm not John Green.
And this is not Crash Course.
But today we're going to talk about Korean Confucianism anyway. But Professor, what makes Korean Confucianism like Korean though?
Yeah, didn't they get it from China or something?
You fools! Well, us from the past, you're not exactly wrong, but well, you're still kind of wrong. We're here to teach you exactly how much you're wrong.
And to, prove that we did learn from our Korean philosophy course, but yes, mostly that.
While Confucianism did indeed originate from China, it, like other traditions across the world, has adapted to remarkably different cultures and evolved into dramatically different forms. But before Confucianism was able to adapt to these different cultures, it needed to take root in these countries first. In Korea, the foundation for Confucianism to flourish was established with the founding of the Joseon dynasty. Jang Do-jeon, also known by his pen name Sangbong, is known as the architect of the new dynasty due to his prominent role in not only the erection of the physical edifices of the Joseon dynasty, but also due to his role in creating a whole new blueprint for the dynasty's policy and social order. He aimed to use his position to emphasize the practical application of Confucian teachings and set a new direction for society under the Joseon dynasty. However, in order to radically reform the existing society in the way he desired, Jang Do-jeon had to not only provide a new vision, but also criticize the prevailing belief system at the time, Buddhism. This is rather significant because Jang Do-jeon ultimately became the first person to break the peaceful coexistence of Confucianism and Buddhism that existed in Korea at that time by launching a systematic doctrinal attack on Buddhism, going so far as to literally write a whole list of critiques he had on Buddhism called the Posi Chapyeon, or an array of critiques of Buddhism. I have had it with the Buddhist teaching of transmigration, which is nothing but a hideous deception to the people of the world. If we deeply fathom all the transformations of heaven and earth and clearly examine the production of human and creatures, then we cannot but understand it is as I have explained here. For those who share my views, let's reflect on this together. Yeah, you can see he's not a fan. Now Do-jeon's contemporary didn't share the same animosity for Buddhism. Gwangun, with the pen name Yangchun, came to prominence after Jang Do-jeon and his supporters were killed over the throne's succession in 1398. Yangchun focused less on the institutionalization of Confucianism and more on generating intellectual vigor amongst people. But this is not to say that Jang Do-jeon and Gwangun did not share any aspirations. In fact, both were strongly anti-Buddhist. The main difference is that Gwangun was more subtle in his critique of Buddhism than Jang Do-jeon, which was arguably more digestible for people who were living in a society that was deeply ingrained with Buddhist ways of thinking. Now that the foundation of Confucianism has been established in Korean society, scholars were able to focus and hone in on their craft, many of them moving to work on and settling controversies. The most prominent scholar to do so was a quiet man by the name of He Wang, but more famously known by his pen name Toge. Toge championed the self-cultivation-oriented form of Buddhism that was characteristic of the Sarian mentality, an intense form of moralism focusing on moral self-cultivation and commitment to the true way. He extremely emphasized cultivating oneself morally and intellectually with a vigor that can be seen both in his life and in his writing. One of his most popular works include the 10 diagrams on sage learning, which, while originally written for the young King Sonju, generations of students have appreciated the clarity with which this brief work presents the essential framework and basic linkages of Neo-Confucian metaphysics, psychological theory, and ascetical practice. Mature scholars return to it continually for the subtlety, balance, and soundness of integral presentation of the vision by which they lived. This, along with helping to integrate the Changzu school into Korea, ultimately shows how Toge influenced Korean Neo-Confucianism by formulating what remains uncertain and what topics are important, a formula that greatly impacted future generations of Korean Confucian scholars. But one last thing to know about Toge is that he was a dualistic thinker when it came to understanding the metaphysics of the world. In the Korean Confucian tradition, it is believed that there are two aspects to everything, which is the structure of the universe that is perfectly complete in everything that exists, and Gi, which is the spatio-temporal quote-unquote stuff that makes up concrete objects. A helpful analogy is that of the sun and how it is reflected differently in various bodies of water depending on how clear the water is. In this case, the one sun that is the same for everyone can be thought of as while the many different types of reflections of it you might encounter in the world can be thought of as Gi. Because Toge took a more dualistic approach to understanding the Yi-Gi relationship, this meant that he believed that, while Yi and Gi cannot be separated from each other, they can be divided in terms of issuance. In other words, he believed that goodness resulted from the issuance of Yi, while evil resulted from the issuance of Gi.
However, not everyone agreed with this view, including Yi, better known by his pen name Yolgok.
Yolgok was a distinguished and successful Neo-Confucian scholar official and a much younger contemporary of Toge. While he tried to implement various reforms during his time as an official, he is most well known for his scholarly work of trying to overcome the tendency for dualistic thought that Toge represented. He tried to argue for a non-dualistic understanding of Confucian metaphysics, arguing that while Yi and Gi were distinct, they were also wholly inseparable. This meant that good and evil could not be solely attributed to Yi and Gi respectively, but rather resulted from the purity or murkiness of the issuing Gi. Toge and Yogok's vastly different views on Confucian metaphysics eventually led them to being prominently involved in key Neo-Confucian controversies, but particularly the 4-7 debate that divided the Korean intellectual world and set the intellectual agenda for generations to come.
Professor, the 4-7 debate? Are we suddenly doing math?
No, Megan from the past, we're talking about one of the 3 most prominent debates in Korean Confucianism, along with the Horak and the ritual debate. We could go on and explain these other debates further, but for the sake of this video, and because we don't want it to get too long, we'll only focus on the 4-7 debate. The 4-7 debate's main point was to address the relationship between the nascent moral tendencies that prominent Confucian Mangzi identified as the 4 sprouts and what were widely regarded as the basic human emotions, the 7 emotions. The 4 sprouts, which were viewed as the roots of key virtues, were a sense of commiseration, shame, deference, and right and wrong, while the 7 emotions were traditionally viewed as including happiness, anger, grief, fear, care, dislike, and desire. Because of his metaphysical views, Toge, and later fellow Korean Confucian scholar Uge, was on the side of the orthodox tradition and believed that the 4 sprouts constitute a special type of emotion that is separate from the 7 emotions. This is because the 4 sprouts are wholly good, and thus must be the issuance of Yi, whereas the 7 emotions are not wholly good, which must mean that they involve the issuance of Gi. However, Yogok and previously fellow Confucian scholar Gobong argued that such a description is too stark and strong, ultimately entailing an excessive dualism. These thinkers instead proposed that the 7 emotions contain the 4 sprouts, and that the 4 sprouts are simply what is good within the 7 emotions. This makes sense considering Yogok's non-dualistic view of the world in which good and evil cannot be solely attributed to Yi and Gi, respectively, but rather must be attributed to the clarity of the issuing Gi. But now that we've covered that, let's head over to the mystery document. Earlier thinkers employed the example of how a man rides a horse as an analogy to the way in which principles rides qi when it is implemented in the world. This is accurate and helpful. Without the horse, the man would have no means for coming and going. Without the man, the horse would lose its way. Man and horse need one another and cannot be separated from one another. Is this Yolgok's writing? Ow! Holy shit!
Is this Toge's response to a passage from Cheng Hao's reply to Master Hengju's letter on calming human nature?
Guess so.
You can tell it's Toge's writing because it talks about the horse, which is representative of Ji, losing its way without the rider, which implies Ji can be issued on its own. But Yogok, with his non-dualistic way of thinking, would probably rather die before implying such a thing, even though he's dead already. So thus far, we've seen that Korean Neo-Confucianism seeks to remain true to the Cheongju school of Confucianism that had been made orthodox in Korea. However, as the Confucian tradition continued to develop there, we see some thinkers make even stronger pushes for Cheongju orthodoxy. Next, we'll look at Song Shiol, better known by his pen name Uam, who is arguably the most orthodox thinker in the Korean Neo-Confucian tradition.
Uam strongly believed that Cheongju Neo-Confucianism was the only right way to follow and was adamant about upholding its orthodoxy. This became especially true after the fall of the cultured Ming dynasty and the rise of the barbaric Qing dynasty in China, because it made Koreans such as Wam feel that they had a particular responsibility to protect the true orthodoxy, of which they had become the sole inheritors. Thus, because of his fanatic devotion, Wam focused on expounding as thoroughly as possible on what Zhu Xi already had taught rather than proposing any quote-unquote original ideas. This is because he felt that even a slight deviation from the track of Zhu Xi was an unpardonable crime. By doing so, Wam used his philosophical and political influence to strengthen the prominence of the Yugok school, which was the dominant scholarly view of political faction of his time. However, Wam's fanaticism didn't stop with Zhu Xi's teaching. He was such a fanatic that he also sought to have the same life experiences as Zhu Xi. Song also had eye trouble just like Zhu Xi, who almost lost his eyesight in later life. But Song rather thought it a great honor to have the same experience as Zhu Xi, even if it meant suffering such an ailment.
Yeah, so basically, if Zhu Xi had a fan club, Uam would have been president.
So now we've seen how dedicated Korean Confucian scholars were to upholding Changshu orthodoxy, but this doesn't mean that there weren't people who tried to challenge this established orthodoxy.
So basically, they're the rebels of Korean Confucianism?
Yeah, basically. And the first rebel we're going to cover is Hagak. Hagak, whose real name was Jung Jidu, challenged the orthodoxy by developing Koreanized Yangmin learning. At the time, a number of thinkers believed that Yangmin learning was the reason why the Ming dynasty declined and eventually collapsed. Because of this, Korean Confucians were determined to keep Korea safe from being contaminated with this type of thinking. However, Hagak sought to counter this way of thinking by presenting Yangmin learning in a more accurate light and showing how it agrees with a broad range of core teachings found in the full range of the Confucian classics. Yet, Hagak did not blindly follow Yangmin learning. Rather, he integrated both Zhu Xi and Yangmin learning with his own interpretations and insights, resulting in the establishment of what So Yi-chung describes as a unique theory and singular school that can be referred to as Hagak learning. This incorporation of Yangmin learning was important because it was in Yangmin learning that Korean scholars were able to find the courage to start thinking beyond the confines of Changshu orthodoxy.
Last but certainly not least, we have Im Yunji-dang and Gang Jong-il-dang, two women Confucian philosophers who challenged the orthodoxy by using Neo-Confucian ideas to support women's equal capacity. While their personal backgrounds and thus genres of writing differed, both women are known for arguing that women are as capable as men of attaining the highest forms of intellectual and moral achievement on the basis of distinctly Neo-Confucian philosophical claims about an original, pure, moral nature shared by all human beings. More specifically, Im was the first to argue that women can become female sages, and Gong continued to develop this claim later on. By doing so, Im and Gong carved out a place for themselves as distinctly women philosophers and created their own lineage that is transmitted between females. So to review, there are three key characteristics that make Korean Confucianism, Korean. The tradition's practical orientation, its intense focus on orthodoxy, and its philosophical care and consideration. But what's the point of talking about Korean Confucianism in the first place, you ask? Well, it's actually quite valuable for people across the globe interested in contemporary philosophy, but particularly those interested in ethical and political philosophy. This is because Korean Confucianism contributes distinctive and sophisticated theories on human nature and moral psychology that provide new ways of thinking about these issues. It also gives moral self-cultivation and education a role in ethics and political theory, which is quite contrary to other major modern moral theories. Lastly, the tradition places a great deal of importance on developing rituals that support healthy moral habits and societal norms.
Thanks for watching, and we'll maybe see you next time.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Very good. It's the old bones.
The old bones.
This is because Korean Confucianism contributes distinctive and sophisticated my bad.
No, you're good. You're
Recording.
Oh,
So walk over. I gotta sit down so it's okay.
yeah, it's fine.
Now you're making me kind of worry. Your video didn't look like it hurt a lot. Oh my gosh. it does shock. Yup, lives up to its name, bro.